Yesterday, I came across a BloombergNEF update about battery metals, and a sentence really caught my attention. So I'll read it for you. BloombergNEF's analysis indicates that North American midstream refining capacity for battery metals is more likely to be an issue than raw material supply. And why is that? It's because global battery metals refining capacity is dominated by China. So if you want to build a battery industry for electric vehicle manufacturing in North America, you not only have to have the minerals, you then have to refine it into the necessary metals. So I'm going to talk to Dr. Kwasi Ampofo, who's head of metals and mining for BloombergNEF. So welcome to the interview.
Thank you, and really great to have me here with you, Markham.
Well, I really appreciate this because this is not it's a topic that hasn't received enough attention yet in North America. We've seen the White House meeting with Canadian officials because Canada is seen as a big supplier of these critical minerals going forward. That's great, but nobody talks about refining capacity. So let's start with China. What does refining capacity in China look like? What percentage of global, capacity do they have, and so on?
So on average, if you take the battery metals, in other words, the metals that go into the production of batteries, if you take all of them collectively as one basket, you're looking at 77% of refining done in China. It's quite a huge number, given the fact that you have close to about 200 countries globally, but then one country dominates with 77%. And then when you put sort of a magnifier on some specific metals, if you take graphite, for instance, to be able to put it in a battery, you need to convert it, or to put it in an anode, you need to convert it in an anode form. China dominates the whole of that market. Almost all major commercially available plants that would turn your graphite into the anode suitable for batteries is now a China story. If you take manganese sulfate, so the metal doesn't go in a battery as a metal, it goes in there as a chemical or in a powder form. And the process to do that is to put it in a sulfate form. So for example, manganese sulfate, over 90% of processing is done in China. If you take nickel sulfate as well, it's still a China story. And if you take the lithiums, still a China story.
So if I understand this correctly, if North America wants to manufacture its own batteries for its own EV manufacturing industry, then it would have to send the minerals from Canada or the United States to China to be processed and then bring them back to make them incorporate them into batteries.
That is exactly what is happening with global supply chain now, right? So Australia is the largest lithium producer from the ground in the spodumene deposits. What is happening now is that almost all the lithium that is mined in Australia ends up in China to be converted into either carbonate or hydroxide suitable for batteries. Similar with what is happening with Chile, most of the lithium ends up in China to be processed into midstream products that are then shipped into countries like the US to be converted into batteries. So the current global supply chain now, that's the exact picture you painted. And moving on, if those free trade agreement countries that have the potential to supply the rocks or the metals to America do not build that midstream capacity, you would have a scenario where, yes, it will be delivered to a US company, finally, but it would have to go through China first.
And of course, that raises the issue of the cost of that material and also supply chain vulnerabilities, vulnerable to geopolitical pressures. And we all know the trade conflict and political conflict between the US and China at the moment. So if Canada is going to build refining capacity, assuming it has all the critical minerals that are required for batteries, Kwasi, what are the barriers to entry into this industry? If you're going to build it, what does it look like?
Yeah, so I think the key barrier, right, and it's all about cost. So a few months ago, we went on sort of a road trip just to try and understand what is happening in the industry. And I think in Canada, I was actually in Canada where I was informed that to build a lithium converter in Canada, it will cost you 10 times more than building that in China. That's quite an incredible variation there, Markham. If you had an investment proposal where it would cost you 10 times cheaper to build in one country over the other, I'm pretty sure what your decision would be. And that is what most businesses think about when they are thinking about these battery midstream refinery projects. There's about where there's a silver line for Canada. And I think it comes to, if we follow or if we look at what China did, the first key is to create demand. Economy of scale pretty much cuts across every industry, and more so for the battery industry. So once you have demand sitting next to you, it becomes easy to scale up very quickly. And that is what we saw happen in lithium-ion battery industry itself. As the adoption increased and there were lots of more manufacturing capacity being built, you realize that costs suddenly came down. And the way it works is that, for example, let's just take this hypothetical scenario. You have a manufacturing plant to produce or to process nickel that is produced in Canada. If you build a 2,000 tons capacity, you would need one front desk person. If you build a 200,000 metric tons person, you still need one front desk person. And the same applies to the technical capability. So labor is not directly proportional, or increase in labor is not directly proportional to increase in tonnage or increase in capacity. At some point, the more capacity you add, probably the less labor you need. It's not directly proportional. So I think the point I'm making overall is that scale matters. For Canada to dominate, they should make sure that there's demand sitting next to them. And that would help drive costs down and compete with China, and also enable them meet the American demand market.
Right. And of course, we're seeing battery plants being set up in the United States, but also in Eastern Canada. There have been a number of announcements recently, some fairly big ones from LG Chem and other big battery manufacturers. So it looks like that demand is beginning to form in North America. And how sensitive are the transportation of economics? Like, let's say that you had, let's pick Alberta, because it's kind of in the middle of the Canadian prairies, and the Canadian EV manufacturing industry will be in Ontario, several thousand kilometers away. If you produce the minerals in Alberta, could you then set up a plant at scale in Alberta and then ship the materials out to Ontario to a battery plant? What are the economics of that likely to be?
Yeah, so that would have a very huge impact. And at BloombergNEF, we've done an analysis. We have an in-house model. We used to estimate that the impact of transport on the overall battery cost. And it would amaze you how pretty significant this could be, right? And let's look at some math here. Okay, so let's take cobalt as an example. So if you dig cobalt out of the ground and you leave it in a concentrated form as rocks, comparing that to processing it further into chemicals. So to ship, you reduce the amount of trucks you need 4 times. So to ship the same material in powder form, you would need 1/4 of the amount of trucks you would have required if you shipped it in a rock form. So once you reduce it into that powder form, it becomes very easy to sort of ship across anywhere in the country. In the GRC, where most of the production is done, the export is actually done in Durban. So it goes, I think it drives for about 16,000 kilometers from South Congo all the way to Durban, where it's exported to China. So clearly there's an added value in sort of utilizing the whole country's manufacturing capacity, as well as where the resources are mined itself. But I do believe that companies can significantly reduce costs if they build the midstream processing closer to where the mining is done. And then obviously that can be tracked to where the battery plants are, and in this case, Ontario. So I think tracking them as rocks, more expensive, more emissions. Tracking them in its chemical form, less expensive, less emissions.
Well, that makes perfect sense. I mean, the more value you can add to the minerals and then reduce their weight and so on, reduces transportation costs. Now, what about other barriers to entry? And I'm thinking particularly about having existing refining capacity, or companies within the country that have refining experience. They already have plants there, and they have technical expertise. You have a supply chain to feed them and so on. Is that a competitive advantage for a country like Canada?
Absolutely. So once again, every year, BloombergNEF publishes what we call the Global Lithium-Ion Battery Supply Chain Ranking, where we look at 30 countries and assess what they are doing in the lithium-ion battery space. And surprisingly, Canada always sits in the top 5 or top 6 whenever we do this ranking. And one of the key factors that drive Canada is precisely what you just brought up, the competitive advantage. And then I always say this as a fun fact whenever I meet industry insiders, is that LFP, which is a lithium iron phosphate battery chemistry, one of the battery chemistries was actually discovered in Quebec. Jeff Dunn, who really has been influential with Tesla's battery chemistry, Tesla's battery research, sits in a university in Canada. So when it comes to that in-house or in-country knowledge in batteries, Canada is actually well placed. Quebec is one of the home of battery technologies. And we've seen Nano One, which is a company currently in British Columbia, also come up with new technology. So Canada is not a place where technology lacks. Another area Canada has competitive advantage in terms of IP and knowledge is recycling. Canada has been doing recycling for a while now, and there are quite some industry giants, even in the lithium-ion battery space as well. Li-Cycle is one company also working on battery recycling. So I think Canada, when it comes to research, when it comes to development, when it comes to innovation, Canada is way ahead of the curve compared to other countries. Although I would say that it's still not yet there if you compare it to countries like China, but it's certainly a pioneer in that space.
I'm fond of saying, Kwasi, that the supply chains, global supply chains for these kinds of industries are in flux. They're being sort of restructured, and there's opportunity here. But how time sensitive is that opportunity? So, for instance, if Canada really got its act together and started, developing this refining capacity over the next year or two, maybe it would take advantage of those opportunities. But is the window likely to be closed, or mostly closed, or partly closed by 2030, say?
Yeah, so I think probably earlier than 2030, and I'll use an example of one of the data we have, right? So every year we publish our electric vehicle outlook, and what it does is it takes a view on how the transport industry will evolve over the next 20 years. And interestingly, what we notice is that as part of that research, we're able to forecast how much metals will be needed to make electric vehicle possible. And 2019, when we estimated how much cobalt the industry would need, it was around 300,000. By 2022, when we run the same forecast based on automakers' commitment, we estimated 150,000. So it's 50% drop. And it just shows you, the reason I bring this up, you're dealing with a very agile industry, okay? Once they hit a roadblock back in 2017, 2018, when cobalt prices rose and there were ethical concerns, to just switch chemistry. So it's very agile. Once they hit a stumbling block, they're able to work around it quickly than legacy industries like the steel sector. And why do I bring this up? We are the starting line of a transition, okay? The same things Canada is doing now, as in government investing in research, development, those are the same things America is doing. Last week, America came up with a bill to fast track its adoption of clean technologies. It's the same thing Indonesia is doing. I was in South Africa, it's the same thing the government is talking about. Almost every major raw material producing country in the world is also thinking about these. So this time sensitiveness would not necessarily even be, let's put the EV dimension aside as to how they're able to evolve and focus on other countries trying to win this race. And I think where Canada fails to act, other countries could potentially fill that gap. And it's very easy to be bypassed, given what we know about cobalt. And the biggest losers in terms of demand loss with that cobalt switch is obviously the DRC. And it's as a result of companies there, or the artisanal sector not being able, or governments not being able to support the artisanal sector to make the supply ethical. So time is very, very fast. 3 years, I would say, is an average time that companies must act to ensure that they are part of the value chain. Other than that, either industry reacts or other countries overtake.
Now, this is a bit of a philosophical question for you, Kwasi, but I've been reading Mariana Mazzucato recently about the entrepreneurial state and how the entrepreneurial state should move into these kinds of industries and de-risk it for the private sector, so that the private sector can scale up. They can innovate and they can scale up, commercialize capacity much more quickly than otherwise. And it's listening to you talk about the timelines here and how Canada seems to be falling behind some of these other countries. It seems like this is a time for the entrepreneurial state to step forward and put the capital required in to de-risk these, building capacity in Canada. Because if you don't do it now, then you're frozen out of that supply chain, perhaps permanently.
Exactly. And then I would even argue that beyond just the entrepreneurial state providing de-risking capital, I would also say that back to the point I made earlier about economy of scale, it's an early technology. In most scenarios, government will be the dominant player for a while, and using that government support to create a market that would scale down costs is also very crucial. So beyond just de-risking capital, I would also say that scale is important. Government can help, local governments, state government, or provincial governments, or national, federal government, as well as companies as well. And I think collectively, they would provide that skill that is required to ensure that Canada produces at competitive rates.
Now, just to tie a bow around this conversation, Kwasi, is it fair to say that in the EV industry, auto manufacturers shifting rapidly to electric vehicle manufacturing, battery storage for EVs and also utility scale and other smaller applications growing rapidly, that this is basically, well, somebody likened it to an arms race. And if you're going to be in the race, you need to race to win. And so it means that interventions that are maybe not be appropriate or thought appropriate 5 years ago, 10 years ago now are appropriate because we need to win the arms race. Are we in an arms race for battery storage and battery minerals and so on? Battery industry?
I mean, my colleagues like to call it an arms race, but then I think in an arms race, being second is the first to lose, right? But I think there's a place for countries that are actually prepared in this race, right? And yeah, I mean, I prefer to say that it's a fun ride. It's a fun ride for countries in the sense that yes, you're racing to bring manufacturing onshore to protect jobs and to also secure the future. But most importantly, the reason why most countries, most companies, most individuals are doing all this is to protect the environment. And that is why I try to less and less refer it as a race. And it's just really a fun ride. Economy's racing to protect the environment. So I would rather put it that way. Ultimately, the winners will be all of us and being able to preserve the earth for ourselves, the children, and the children's children.
Fair enough. Thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you so much, Markham, for having me.